The really weird thing about getting to this topic towards the end of the year of aircraft carriers, and after having done as many videos as I have done on naval aviation so far in this channel's history, because, well, as I said before, that was my PhD topic. The development of naval aviation in the 1920s and 30s. So it's kind of a happy thing for me to return to. Is that, honestly, there's quite a few other videos I could point you to. There really are quite a few other videos to point you to. In fact, when I started off thinking about the Bearn, which of course is an abject lesson in what happens when politics gets far too involved in your ship design. Far, far too involved. And there are so many issues with her design which literally come down to the answer is politics. Politics. There are some really excellent lifts there. There is, the aft lift is a really spectacular thing. Having 3 lifts for 3 different types of aircraft is that's the sort of idea which comes up, and someone goes, well, yeah, this means we can have a really fast lift for our fighters, and then we can have a lift which can take the weight of our torpedo bombers fully loaded, and one which is suitable for launching our reconnaissance aircraft. So they go, that sounds great. You've got one ship. It's only got a certain amount of space. Having 2 slightly faster versions of this lift, which can take everything in your set, would probably have been the better option. Just saying. Would probably have been the better option. Yes, 3 lifts are nice, but 2 decent sized lifts that can take everything at a fast enough speed, maybe not as fast, but fast enough, will probably make your life easier in the long run. But this way, you can give the manufacturer to 3 different designers and 3 different teams, and you can spread around the load of love and money. But yes, the thing that I've realized very quickly when I started doing this video is that, and I'm going to put links to them, I have already done a video on the history of French naval aviation. I have already done a video about their squadron structure. I've already done videos about the Bearn. So that means I can afford to make this video very much about the doctrine. Because, and please do comment if I've forgotten to upload the links to those videos here, and the links aren't appearing one after the other above me. I apologize. I was distracted by builders. Please just comment to remind me, and I will do them as soon as I can. But, yeah. French Naval Aviation Doctrine. It's interesting. It really is. They have one carrier. And if you think about the carrier powers in the 1920s and 30s, there is only one nation which is operating one carrier. The rest are all building more. They're soon to be operating more than one carrier. Or they are operating more than one carrier in the case of the British. But the French are just operating one carrier. And they have a really interesting dichotomy, because the main area of home naval aviation, which you'd expect to worry about in the Mediterranean, they don't really need aircraft for. They don't really need a carrier for, because of the sheer number of land bases they have around the Mediterranean where they're operating. Whilst the carrier is of advantage, it's only really going to become of advantage in a fighter protection role later on. It's not really necessary for reconnaissance, and definitely not necessary for strike, because the land facilities can provide you with far more capability in that region due to the sheer number of bases they have. This is one of those usual things that people start going, well, land-based aircraft are always better than the sea-based aircraft. They're not. Especially not today. They are about the same in every way realistically. The difference is usually, a land base is going to allow you more space to spread everything out, so you can therefore achieve things with more aircraft. But you need a lot of those, and those bases don't move. And that's always that's always the advantage of the carrier versus the land base. The carrier can move. You can move it where you need it in the world. And people sometimes go around with quotes, and the French themselves in this period were looking into it, were discussing the cost of setting up an air base versus the cost of setting up a carrier. The trouble was, and this interesting point is that the French really started this debate off and started looking into this debate of air bases versus carriers. In the UK, the debate was how many aircraft equate to a battleship. In France, it was what's the value of an air base versus an aircraft carrier. And the issue started to come up with the various things which we're still discussing today. There's the fact that when you invest in an aircraft carrier, you're usually investing most money internally. So the money goes into your own country, so it's valuable to your own domestic economy. Whereas if you're building a base abroad, it might be cheaper, but that money is being spent in another country. And the money's going out. It might be a colony, but it's still another country. And then there's the fact that, well, if you spend all that money on a base there, that doesn't cover over there, or over there, or over there, or over there. So you need to spend a lot of money on bases to give you the same capability of a carrier of being able to take the things with you. Now, there are certain areas in the world where you can pretty much predict you're going to have problems and you're going to need a force there. In which case, you might as well build the airbase because it's probably cheaper in the long run. But then that's when you get into what's beyond the financial considerations. There's the political considerations. Do you have faith that you're going to still control that colony? Do you have faith in that ally? Are they always going to allow you to use that base when you need to? Or are they going to at some point go, no, you can't use this for this operation because it's going to upset our domestic or our international relations? And there's the political cost. And then there's the fact of, what happens if that ally does things interesting to their people internally in their government? And you've basically signed up to that government because they're supporting you having that base, and maybe the opposition won't let you have that base, but that government is in turn doing things that you really would like them not to be doing because it's making you look bad domestically. Oh, that's another layer of political cost. So yes, there are lots of problems with those bases. There are advantages, there are disadvantages. It's always the case in the defense and procurement and pretty much most of adult and mature life. There are no simple answers to any question. Everything has pluses and minuses. And often it's a value-based judgment. It's not a simple put in these figures, this has come out, this is simple, it's yes or no. No. Well, yeah, even if the obvious answer can come up with a number of, well, there are going to be these problems, and this is how far we can see ahead in the future. We can't really see that far ahead in the future. We can tell you what happened in the past. So yes, the French get into that debate rather early on, and they have lots of books written about it, and some of them are beautiful in their calligraphy. I'm going to emphasize on the calligraphy because some of them I spend far more time on style than substance. But I'm not going to name names here because that's something for you to discover yourselves. But honestly, the French Naval Aviation, as said, in the Mediterranean, has one situation. In the rest of the world, it has other situations. It's both supposed to provide an organic capability for its own fleet if they're doing worldwide operations, but also, what's the most important pillar of French security under the treaty system? It's their alliance with Britain. It really is. Because they don't have faith in America because of America's constant neutrality stand of we don't want to get involved in things. So you can't rely on America as an ally at this point. And the French have let themselves sign up to a treaty where they've got equality with the Italians, which means they can't just outbuild them, but it also means that technically they need all their forces in the Mediterranean to defend against the Italians if there's a war with them, but they have also an empire around the world, which means that in reality the only way they can work that out is they can square that particular circle is if they are allied with either Britain or America closely. Britain's the obvious partner. But there's a problem then. That means, as an ally, if you want to ensure that your ally is going to be, especially a large ally, is going to be truly beholden to you, you have to make yourself indispensable to them. That often means pursuing capabilities which they might not have, but will probably need. Complementary capabilities. Capabilities which perhaps are niche and they, in the sheer mass and volume of capabilities they don't have, or they don't have enough of. And that's pretty much the issue of French Naval Aviation Doctrine. It's trying to fit all three together. The issues of the Mediterranean, the issues of their own independent force structure around the world, and the issues of where they fit in the British force structure around the world. Which does lead to some really interesting ideas. Truly interesting ideas. With that being said, Shameless book plug. Now, I have to say, thank you to everyone who's bought a copy of this book. Now, I know I do this in every single video because, well, in the UK, your academic career is as good as the books you sell and the journal articles you get read, and frankly, no one's going to advertise either of those unless it's you, so I do that. But also use it to say thank you to everyone for supporting the channel. For especially people who've been, doing super chats and things lately towards the Clarke fund. And because all the funds being raised are going towards Clarke at the moment. I am going to be doing a Historiathon soon, and that's going to have some specific fundraising targets for basically next year. Things which are going to be, hopefully include my first solo trip to America for a research trip, and a few other things. Basically things which I'm hoping people will like the idea of, as much as I like the idea of. That will be explained in due course, but yes, none of this would be possible without you. None of this would be possible without your support, and thank you. Thank you. It really does matter, and it really does make a massive difference. And it's kind of weird because amongst my colleagues who are, to an extent, public-facing historians or historians of this period, I have the conversations all too often along the lines of funding and getting funding for research and doing research. And honestly, I am starting to realise that I have I've been realising it for a while, but I'm starting to think they're realising it. That I have a far easier life in some way than them, because I get funded from my research and all my naval history work by you. I work to live, to make sure I have enough money for food and to pay my expenses, etc. But to pay for all my research, to pay for all my book buying and all my other stuff, all the bigger research trips, etc. It's all entirely thanks to you. You're what makes it work. You're what makes the next books possible and all those things. And yeah, you all that seems to be required of me, and I quite like it delivering on this one, is to keep producing some videos on YouTube to answer your questions and to listen as much as I speak, which I try to do. So thank you. That being said, let's get into the Air Group. Now, the question is, what does Bearn's Air Group really tell us about French Naval Aviation Doctrine? Well, it tells us a lot. They've got torpedo bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, dive bombers coming in, and fighters. They're also quite late to the dive bomber party, but that's mainly, I would say, because for quite a while, dive bombing was something which fighter aircraft and most aircraft could really do. Purpose-built dive bombers are something which is realistically, we're talking a 1930s onwards sort of idea coming in. There were some traces before then, but realistically, pretty much every aircraft did dive bombing, and one of the examples I give is the Fairey Swordfish is rated as a dive bomber. It basically does what's called helicopter dive bombing these days, but it's almost geostationary bombardment in that their speed of dive when they are vertical can be quite so slow that you are almost hovering above your target to drop your bomb. It's a methodology. But yes, the Wilbot 7, the fighter, that was the last fighter to operate off the Bearn. It had issues, but there again, one of the problems of all these aircraft is they are small production runs. Again, with the PL7, level side PL7, that's something which is both on the carrier, off the carrier with problems, back on the carrier, off the carrier, back on the carrier. It has a whole history. The thing is, the French are trying to pursue their own production capabilities, their own capabilities in their own aircraft. They're very much on these of, this needs to be something organically French, this needs to be something which comes from us. And that is a core point of their naval aviation. They want to have an independent capability, even if they might not need to have it for independent reasons. And that's the interesting thing to think about. They want an independent capability even if they don't necessarily have it for independent reasons. In fact, you could argue many of the reasons why they pursue an aircraft carrier, especially in the earlier periods, is codependency. It's to have something which is going to help out the British in the way the British are most focused, which is dealing with surface raiders and the wider threats of any war. British pursue aircraft carriers very heavily in the 1920s as part of their ability to defend against surface raiders, to defend against commerce disruptors. That's a very important task for the British. Attacking fleets in harbour, commerce defence, these are critical things of carriers. They also want to be able to attack fleets, and they want to be able to attack things at night, but those are things they're working towards. In the 20s, what they're looking at and what they're really talking about are the abilities to defend commerce. That's why carriers like Hermes make so much sense. They're cruiser carriers, and to an extent, the Bearn, you can look at her speed and you go, well, actually, maybe that makes sense if all you're doing is poodling around an area, providing the aerial reconnaissance and, aerial operations side of a anti-surface radar task force. You can say that, but then you realise that any carrier is going to be attached to a heavy task force, which is going to be needing to rapidly deploy between areas, and suddenly the speed doesn't make sense. But we'll leave that to another side. That is all a factor of the politics going into our engines. But truthfully, what we get from the Air Group and its development is that the French are looking for agile, capable fighters. They're looking for long-range reconnaissance aircraft. They're looking for decent strike aircraft that can provide them with a heavy thump. They want to be tactically flexible. They want to be strategically flexible. And they want to be operationally secure. Well, how can I say that? There you go. Tactically flexible. The strike aircraft. They can strike land targets, they can strike sea targets, they can do ASW operations, they can do whatever you need them to do. Your reconnaissance aircraft, that's your strategic flexibility. They can keep an eye on what's going on around you, so it allows you to know whether you should rapidly vamoose an area, whether you should cooperate with you should conglomerate into an allied group, a larger group, or whether you can actually wander around solo fairly safely. And your fighters, well, as I've said before, fighters are about the outer layer of air defence, and one of the interesting things about the French doctrine is it very quickly develops along very similar lines to the British doctrine, where the fighter emphasis is not so much about killing your opponents as breaking up the strikes. You see, killing an opponent might mean you knock out one of them. Breaking up an enemy strike force, A, is going to free up a lot quicker to carry on doing that, and B, it's probably going to lead to the deaths of dozens of them, because if an enemy strike force is attacking surface ships and they're able to concentrate, let's say, 16 aircraft onto one ship at a time, they're going to overwhelm it. But if you've broken them up with heavy AA and fighters into 1s and 2s attacking a ship, and they're attacking from the same angle, then suddenly they become a lot easier for the AA and of things on the ship to engage and disassemble. So, yeah, that works. And this is the point. French naval aviation has been pushing along these lines. Again, their doctrine shows through as much in the forensic engineering as it does in the writing. When we look at the engineering, when we look at the decisions they're making engineering-wise, it makes sense. The free lifts thing never makes sense. The free lifts thing never makes sense. It's one of those things of, it makes sense probably to some engineers who proposed it and to someone who thought, I can spread this work around with all my friends. But anyone who actually operates ships should have looked at it and gone, so you want free lifts which are specific to their types of aircraft, and which means if one lift goes down, any one of those free lifts goes down, A, we're in trouble with operations, B, we can't then operate that aircraft. We're in trouble with operations because of where they position in deck. And once you especially have clamshell systems, which is what they chose to do, operating for lifts, that especially adds issues on the deck. There is sensibility to it, yes, there is sensibility to it, but it's not a good one. It's not a good look. And this ultimately is the problem for the French, because the French Empire is massive. And yes, a large chunk of that is the Sahara, because the British were mean. But there again, we like to be mean to the French, and the French like to be mean to us. So, get over it. The French have quite a vast empire to go over and protect. And that's the trouble again. Having an empire can be great. It can be lovely, you know, for your ego and all these things, but you have to protect it. You have to govern it. And you have to both invest in it in order to extract anything from it, as well as find a way for it to invest in you. And those are very, very difficult things to do. In this case, realistically, and I do say this realistically, the French were at a disadvantage in 1919 to 1939. Washington Naval Treaty, London Naval Treaties really did them a disadvantage. But there's also the problem that the most productive parts of the empire in terms of finances are also the parts of the empire which are the furthest away from France. So your cornerstone, your industrial heartland, the thing you have to keep safe, is back there in France. But the economic drivers which were helping France recover from World War I and get itself going on were the other side of the world. And this is where their problem lies. I know I've said this a couple of times in this video, but I need to emphasize this point as being a fundamental basis of their strategy and their naval aviation and their doctrine development. Because it's kind of like with the Soviet Union and defense of Russia, defense of the motherland. This is a key driver. All the decisions stem, in some regard, from this point. But realistically, the French also had other problems. The French had a never-ending desire of a line of politicians and changing politicians seeking for quick-fix solutions to their problems. Ultimately, the problem that naval aviation stumbled into, despite developing some really interesting ideas of how it would be orientated, how it would provide reconnaissance platforms, how they would interact with both land-based aviation and seaplane aviation in terms of their seaplane carrier, and how they would cooperate and work together with the carrier providing the mobile facility, the seaplane carrier providing, or the seaplane carrier providing a facility which basically sets up in the nearest bay, suitable area to provide long-range maritime patrol from there and support those aircraft operations, as well as providing, in a way, I would argue it also the seaplane carrier and the way it's structured and the way the things around it, the ideas are structured around it almost provides a ready-made logistical base for the naval aviation operation in the area. So it's kind of like, to an extent, like the idea behind HMS Unicorn with the Royal Navy, but the idea is more, it goes into sort of a mixture between Unicorn and the mobile naval air basing units. Monabs, it turns up and it sets up a facility around it that you can then use to base and support your Bearn or whatever comes afterwards. But the big problem for the French is that the niche they soon work out for themselves that's going to fit most with the British needs are these anti-surface raider squads, which have to be fast and heavy. It's one of the reasons why they do the fast capital ship route. That's why they build the Dunkirks. You know, these ships do not come out of nowhere. They are very sensible for the French Navy to go down the route of. Yes, they can't make them what I would call full level period battleships because they have limitations of their own industrial might, and they're building it all domestically. So they're limited to what they can build, but they still do build fast battleships. They're just very lightly armed fast battleships compared to what other contemporaries might be putting in. Simply because that's what they can build at that time. That's what they have available. The trouble is, the Bearn really doesn't fit with that. It's not fast enough. It's not got long enough legs in terms of its range and capacity. And its air group isn't large enough either. It is a converted battleship, and in many regards, it is probably the worst battleship conversion that took place. You've got Eagle, which could do 24 knots, roughly. Sometimes a little bit faster, sometimes a little bit slower. And would take roughly 30 aircraft. You've got a Karga. It's a Kagi's and the Amagi class battle cruiser, isn't she? It's Karga, which is the battle or ship conversion. And she could do 28 knots, and she could take roughly 72 aircraft in active duty, 18 in storage, so capacity of 90 aircraft on that thing. And Eagle's also got some in storage, and this is where it gets interesting. Official figures are usually, in terms of operating aircraft, roughly 25 to 30, but sometimes a bit more. And then there's Bearn, which is 21.5 knots and carries 32 aircraft and actually displaces more than Eagle. It's just, it's got so many different ideas in it. The thing is, the problem with the Bearn and this scenario at this point is it's not fast enough. Believe it or not, Eagle probably would have been fast enough if it could have done 24 knots. And we're not talking a big difference in power plant here, because Eagle's power supply was 4 shafts, 4 geared steam turbine sets, and the Bearn is a steam turbine set which supplies 2 shafts and 2 triple expansion steam engines which supply a shaft each. So it's both 4 shaft designs. They both have plenty of shafts for plenty of for power to be put down them. That's an advantage. All 4 of them, I think, are 4 shaft designs. Yes, the Karga is a 4 shaft design as well. The difference is the boilers and the pressure you're putting through the turbines, and the fact that 2 of them are all turbine designs and 1 of them is a mixed. And the thing is, if you're going to keep up with a fast-moving group of ships, capital ships, you need to be able to do more than 21 knots. You really need to. Yes, they're not always racing around the world at their full speed, but you need to be fast enough to keep up with them when they're moving at a heightened speed. Because they could be moving from, let's say, the Central Atlantic hunting area to the South Atlantic, or from the southwestern Indian Ocean to the northeastern Indian Ocean hunting zones, because they're the heavy units, they're the response force, and the reason they have a carrier with them is to provide them with the information they need when they get there to make sure they can hunt down that big target as efficiently as possible. If you're talking about small surface raiders and the ones which are merchant ships, you're probably using land-based aviation, long-range maritime patrols, and cruisers to hunt them down. When you're talking about deploying carriers and capital ships, and this is the evolution which takes place really throughout the 20s, you're hunting down larger vessels. You're hunting down Panzerschiff, and you don't want to waste any moment in that, because those things can kill your cruisers if they're one-on-one. As was shown by the Battle of River Plate, it's a bit different when your cruisers start ganging up on them. But, you know, that's a scenario which in many ways is arranged that way by the Royal Navy commanders, who go, there is one place they're going to end up. Let's call in all our cruisers from all this area. Yes, we're going to sacrifice the breadth of our search, but we're fairly sure where they're going to be, so we're going to call everything into there and have it all waiting in one place. And if the Grass Bay had gone somewhere different, they'd have had massive egg on their face. It's a gamble. And again, this is why you have the heavy units and why they come with a carrier, so they don't have to gamble as much. Now, with that in mind, that starts to affect what you're thinking about for the Joffre class, what you're thinking about for the future carrier designs. And the Joffre class are interesting in that pretty much they are an evolution beyond the Bearn. They do have some very good ideas included there. But I don't know which particular person in the French Navy is so obsessed with funny shaped lifts, because they can't seem to get out of the idea that it's a good idea to have. Now, admittedly, that stern lift, you can, in a nice way, it's got enough space around it that it really isn't going to matter. Okay, as long as the airplane themselves can fit their undercarriage on there, it does not matter. It's got space either side. It's not going to cause any trouble. This lift forward, it works. But again, you start to see the difference between a power which is believing it's not going to have to use its aviation that often in the Mediterranean, and a power which thinks, A, we operate in the North Sea, B, we're going to have to use the Mediterranean, C, we're going to South China Sea, and D, we're going to be opposite side of the world from our industrial base. The French are thinking, we're not probably going to have to use carrier aviation in the Mediterranean because we've got so many land bases, and B, if we are operating anywhere in the world, we are supporting an ally, and honestly, if the ship gets knocked out, it comes back to France. We are an adjunct to the ally. They're the major power, the major naval power. We are providing extra capabilities that slot in. We are doing our bit as an ally. And that explains a lot of the design decisions made with the Joffre class. But, and I say this from a very loving place on the Joffre class, they have some good ideas going on, and they have some capabilities, and they are about growing the capability of the French Navy. Named as only the French can after a army officer and a mathematician / statesman. In case of the second vessel in the class, the Panliv, the Joffre was being built by Ateliers et Chantiers de Saint-Nazaire Penhoë, St. Nazaire's big yard, and it's laid down in November 1938. Penhoë never laid down. Joffre's never launched, and her construction was abandoned, scrapped in June 1940. They used a lot of similar systems from the Bearn. They did try and continue a lot of the similar ideas. They managed to evolve some of the ideas away from them, and they had taken some note of the British carriers and how they're operating, because, again, the Bearn is full of a lot of very good ideas. But if I give you, for example, the rail system which they developed, which allows you to secure the aircraft, and is the safest for moving aircraft around on a ship, it really is. The problem is, if you have any disruption, any damage to those rails, then you have a lot of problem moving aircraft around on a ship, especially aircraft which are down in the lower hangar being maintained, etc. It's really a problem to deal with. And it's kind of like centerline lifts versus deck edge lifts. Centerline lifts have a lot of flexibility and a lot of addition to them, but they do take up space in your hangar. And if anything goes wrong with them, they're going to muck up your flight deck. Whereas deck edge lifts, if they stall, they're off the side of the deck anyway, and you can fix them without disrupting the hangar and without disrupting everything else. But, of course, centerline lifts are going to provide you with less top weight because they are not off balanced, they are over the center line, and less things you'd have to work out from a naval architecture perspective to balance and stabilize against. It's all fors and against. The Joffre class are realistically the French going, right then, we do need 2 carriers. And they'd always been allocated 2 carriers, but they hadn't built a second one. They just kept operating the Bearn until they felt they understood enough and had really built up need for it enough. And the realistic idea is that this would allow them to maintain a carrier in their far eastern territories, and one sitting in the Atlantic, pretty much on either lower readiness, doing the maintenance, or wandering over the Caribbean as and when needed. Those sort of things. It was sitting there for when it was required. The trouble was, it was still having to deal with, and their whole construction was still having to deal with the fact that the French Admiralty was divided on the subject of naval aviation, was focused on their German and their Italian counterparts who were going, they're building battleships. The German Graf Zeppelin program was always a bit of a slow burner, if not something which wasn't actually getting started at all. And as such, they realistically kept going, oh, if they're not investing in ships and the British have enough ships, we don't need to. We can carry on as we're doing. And that's one of the reasons why they are delaying the class and putting battleships in its place and all sorts of things in terms of their construction. They only need one for the Far East. That's where they need it. They need the one for the Far East presence. And, maybe you can keep the Bearn operating for a bit, and that can be the backup carrier for the Atlantic. And there's all sorts of ideas put forward. But realistically, the problem they're facing is that, and I do make this, is that sometimes you can place too much emphasis on what your enemies are doing. Because your enemies are not in the same strategic situation as you are. And that is the real problem for the French when it comes to their development of naval aviation and their capability of doing the operations they want to do. The French geostrategic position is unique. They have a unique case, realistically, which pushes them for aviation. And especially when the Italians aren't pursuing naval aviation, and because they don't need to, you don't need to in the Mediterranean, but that if you have those carriers, and this is what some of the French naval aviators were arguing, well, that helps you over here. That helps you over here. And realistically, this gives you a good idea of the fact that the French are in a very similar situation to the British when it comes to their strategic security. Where their bases are, where they can operate from, where they have some support. In order to cover that, you need something out there. And if you can't send capital ships, because your capital ships need to focus in the Mediterranean on their Italian counterparts, well, a carrier's quite a big statement to send. But the Bearn was never really suitable to send. So for the French, they both had the answer in their naval aviation doctrine, in what they're developing in terms of its trade protection role, in terms of its flexibility. They weren't really looking at the same strike investment as the British in some regards, but that's mostly because of the number of carriers they're planning on building and their operational experience with them. I think they are planning on building in the flexibility to do strikes. They're just not focusing on it. And I think they're planning on building flexibility in with their carriers of providing, well, definitely are building into them the flexibility to cover and support task forces as they move around the world. The problem is when you only have one, especially in this era, and it's not really what you want when you're talking from naval perspective, because of decisions made in its construction. And one of the reasons it was chosen for carrier conversion, and this is the really funny thing, is the Navy chose it because it did have all turbines. And then it gets mucked up by someone having well, either it's a bright idea, you could argue, because some people argue, well, the triple expansion engines do give very reliable long range movement these days. Yes, but so do the turbines at this point. The turbines aren't exactly falling apart. If you'd been making that case 20 years previously, you could have made that case, but since about 1903-4, that the turbine reliability has got to the point where it's not falling apart for long-range cruising. Yes, the triple expansion engine is ever so slightly more efficient for that role, but not enough to really justify it over the other things it brings in terms of the power density. So yeah, the French have a doctrine. The doctrine is support their carriers and support their fleet operations wherever they need to, outside of the Mediterranean, and trade protection, so scouting and finding their opponents and having a tactical flexibility. But the reality is they don't get to evolve that doctrine or develop it into what we would call a tactical or pragmatic doctrine, realistically, because of the limitations imposed on them by their carrier. And they're not the only ones who are frustrated in some ways at this point, because there's also the Italians. And the Italians have a lot of great aviators, but they have a problem. Both the Air Force and the Navy have the same minister, Il Duce. That boy, fun boy, the less improved World War II edition, Mussolini. And honestly, you can see why they're making the case of we don't need a carrier in the Mediterranean, but there also is a very good argument for having a carrier in the Mediterranean. And that's organic air defense, because in the Mediterranean, like the South China Sea and various other points in the world, or if you're operating close to the enemy coastline, doing a blockade, as the British were looking at Japan, the odds are you're going to be attacked. The odds are you are going to be dealing with air attack. And in the pre-radar world, that means the odds are some aircraft are going to break through, no matter how many layers, no matter how you structure it, because you're not going to get warning in time enough to make sure the cap is always in the right position, etc. So that's one level problem. But if you don't have a cap, you don't have any fighters at all, then they're definitely going to get through. So if you want to have air defense for your task group when it's moving around, and to extent assistance with anti-submarine warfare by giving you some surface search, search capabilities, you have to have something with you to support that. Because, as I've discussed on this channel many times over last year, the one true thing about aircraft that's been the same is you cannot maintain them in the mid-air. You cannot rearm them in mid-air at this current time. And in this period, whilst attempts are being made, no one seriously can refuel them in mid-air operationally. I know there was some aircraft which literally people got out and walked across the wings with fuel hoses and pumped fuel from one aircraft to another into, and I know various other fun things happened. But seriously, at this point, there is, for single seat fighters, on terms of mass capability, it hasn't yet been worked through enough to be adapted for it. So even refueling, this is where a carrier comes in. And again, the Italians get there very late, and then they're converting a liner in World War II. Basically, they're doing a crash conversion. And this is as far as the Aquila gets. It's a really interesting idea, but it's basically, it's going to provide an air defense capability. There's talks about strike aircraft and all these things, and yeah, I'm sure it would carry some. It would be stupid for it not to carry some capability of strike. But it's all more about fighting, more about air defense of the force at sea, and providing them with the ability to operate in a very non-permissive environment. Because that's, if you think about it, how do humans deal with a cold? How do humans deal with torrential downpours? It's layers. You layer up your clothing. It's the same with air defense at sea. It's the same with operating in modern warfighting. You add in your layers because one layer is not going to be enough to stop the enemy. And anyone who tells you this weapon system, having that alone is going to stop the enemy coming in, they're the salesman. They're not a practitioner. They'll tell you that because they're trying to make a sale, but you have to treat them with the same mind you treat a used car salesman. Which leads us to the other carrier aviation doctrine, which was in its nascent, not yet built state in this time period, and sort of fits again with the French one in that you have a lot of people who are not quite sure how it applies to them, but it should do. Because for the Germans, whilst it doesn't fit with the Baltic operations, if you're going to break out into the North Sea, if you're going to break out into the North Atlantic from the North Sea, you're going to at least need to be able to deal with reconnaissance aircraft to try and stop them reporting your position. At the very least, which means you need fighters. And you're probably going to have to deal with the presence of perhaps an enemy airstrikes capabilities, in which case, again, fighters. You're going to want to find your own prey if you're out raiding in the North Atlantic, so you need lots of reconnaissance aircraft, and a carrier is far better for launching and recovering those without having to stop than a regular ship is. So, yeah. A carrier starts to make a lot of sense. And, you can add in a strike capability, so it could be hitting suitable targets a long way away from the task group and widening the area of effect and causing more problems for anyone watching to work out exactly where you are, because you're widening the box that you could be in. Yeah. A carrier makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, all three of these powers fell into the other guys category. They're concentrating on a battleship. They're concentrating on a battleship. They're concentrating on a battleship. So that's what I should be concentrating on. And the thing is, at this point, and when we're talking about 1930s, the battleship and carrier are complementary. This is the first thing which the British have realistically realized. The Americans are on their way to there, and the Japanese are sort of there. In that, you need both. The carrier hasn't yet reached the point that it can guarantee kill, and I mean kill, not stop, not pause, disable, but kill any threat against it in all weathers. The battleship can, but it doesn't have the range or versatility in terms of the area effect and the gradations that a carrier can bring. Carrier has a wider area of effect, but the battleship is your guaranteed kill system. So basically, you need those two to work together. 1930s, that's what you need. You need them to pair up. There is a reason why the British are ordering as many carriers as they are capital ships. Especially once the 1937 London Treaty basically goes bye-bye, and they're free building. They are building as many of them as they can get. Equal numbers. Carriers are being ordered, capital ships being ordered. And there's often discussion about that because there is some delay in some of the carrier orders going through. But the fact is, you've got, in the timeline that's coming in, you've got the Implacables, you've got the Illustriouses, and you've got Unicorn all being built. You've got the King George V's, you've got Vanguard, and then you've got Lions. So you basically go, right, King George V's, you're building 5 of those, and you're building 4 Illustrious class. Okay. So one more, alright. You want to build Vanguard, you're also already building Unicorn. Unicorn's actually under construction. Vanguard is later to order. Okay, so that adds in. And then you're going, Lions, and you've ordered the 2 Implacables. And you're going to be ordering 2 more Lions next year and 2 more Lions next year. And there's already discussions about more of the Implacables to come afterwards, or maybe something slightly bigger. And this is the point. You have these as your options, but the thing is, the French, the Germans, and the Italians are very much trapped into a mindset of looking at each other when it comes to their construction. And going, which is kind of weird. It both makes sense because they're building against each other to a large part, but also doesn't make sense when you think they're on completely different strategic situations. They realistically are, and this is a problem, and this is what today's question is going to be, and today's summary is about, is realistically, nations... I want you to think about what are good examples of nations building to fit their strategic situation in terms of naval aviation, in terms of any ship and any fleet design, and nations where they're not. I would argue consistently the Germans get things historically consistently quite wrong. The High Seas Fleet is the Grand Fleet in slightly smaller, when realistically there are certain things of the Grand Fleet which you don't need if you're the High Seas Fleet, and there are certain things which you really do need which the Grand Fleet doesn't have. And yet they are almost building a High Seas Fleet in miniature. They're building, the High Seas Fleet are building a sort of almost a Grand Fleet in slightly smaller scale, and then you've got Japan and some of their construction is similar, and some of the American construction early on, and some of the British construction. Even to this day, there are issues. I would argue, when we're looking at some of the ship designs, one of the things I would argue with the British that we've got wrong consistently in the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, is we build ships which are too specialist. We used to have a really good line in generalist ships, but the idea suddenly came through that we've got smaller fleets, so therefore our ships need to specialise, which actually shrinks the fleet more. It used to be we built generalist ships, which were general purpose, and yes, we had some which were more focused in their capability than others, but they were general purpose vessels. And so they could do a wide range of jobs. Now it's a case of, well, we're building a destroyer. It's an air defense vessel. Oh, so we won't fit it with Mark 41 VLS and land attack missiles. No. We can't do that because that's going to cause a funding battle. No, that should be the obvious thing of making a useful asset. And then when your argument is... And this funny thing that comes up when you're cutting the ships, they're going, oh, we don't want to build any more of these ships because they don't fit the future needs, because they're so orientated on air defense role. That was one of the reasons used for cutting the Type 45 procurement. Was literally that. And you sort of go, well, they're built for, but not with the Mark 41 VLS. If you just fitted them, and were fitting the ones you were building with the Mark 41 VLS and those cells, then they'd be general purpose assets. They'd have a great air defense capability, but they'd have a general purpose capability as well. And that argument doesn't work on cutting them, does it? On cutting their numbers and their procurement. So this is today's question. I want you to think of good examples of examples where nations have done this well. I mean the good ones. So when they have fitted their construction to their strategic needs, and ones where nations have not done it well. And you can also, and here's the thing I would like to emphasize before people start thinking these are blanket statements. No, sometimes nations will procure some ships which very much do fit their strategic need, and then they'll procure others which really don't. And that's allowed to be say, well, they are in part, they're doing well in other parts. I don't know what they're doing this for, and that's a good thing to discuss. So, I hope you found it enjoyable and interesting. French Naval Aviation Doctrine, pretty much, it's a reaction to events, and it's about development of a capability, but it's also constantly vying to show that capability and its utility in operations. Again, thank you to everyone for all your support. The bookshelves, the next big order is going to be the feet, which are coming through, which sounds fun. I need to order at least 8 for in here. They're going to be 4 white ones and 4 black ones, so that's 120 quid to be spent on Clarke's feet. And there's got to be, I've got to put some more Clarke's in here because they only work for the 4x2s, they don't work for the 4x3s. But I think I will, at least definitely short term, need another couple of 4x2s in here as well. So I probably should order 10 Clarke's feet actually, and the 2. Oh yeah. I don't have a problem. I just don't have enough I just don't have enough books, and I don't have enough bookshelves for the books I already have. It's not a problem. It's a historian. And I also want to show you something else as well before we get out the year of the aircraft carrier. Wasn't it supposed to pop up? It's coming. We've got coming up as well next week never built aircraft carriers, which I hope you'll enjoy. But I wanted to give you an example of some of the graphics I do try around with, because I tried to take the basing graphic and overlay it over the French Empire graphic, and found that they are completely different projections of the Earth, and so these things move around a bit. It's still quite interesting, but I couldn't really use it to illustrate my point. And I had to say, this did lead me to an interesting discussion, because someone wrote on a comment recently, a video, I wish you were using more maps to illustrate your points, etc. in these scenarios. And the trouble is, it's finding a map which illustrates what I want to say it. And realistically, what I would like is to combine these two maps, the Empire map and the basing map. But trying to get it to work together is just not working. Just not working. Sadly enough. Anyway, thank you very much for your support, thank you very much for your kindness and your help, and thank you very much for keeping the channel going and making it what it is. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's given you a bit of an introduction to French Naval Aviation Doctrine and the problems it faced, and the reason why we don't have more from it, because honestly they just don't get to do much in World War II. They really don't. They're left with the Bearn, and that can't deliver on the doctrine they've been developing. They've got the Joffre's plan for the doctrine they've been developing, but they never get finished. Despite being started early enough that, realistically, and this is the thing which is always an interesting point to me in case of the Joffre class, in case of especially the Joffre herself, she's technically started in November 1938. But they were ordered early enough. And when I say early enough, they were decided to sort of start working on them in roughly 1936-37, and they're authorized in 1937. So they were ordered early enough. It could have been laid down earlier, and it could have been launched before June 1940, and when there is the whole armistice. And there's always the part which I think about was if it had been launched, considering it's in Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast, there is every possibility it could have been towed to Britain. It could have been towed to Britain. It could have both ended up being used by the Germans, or it could have been towed to Britain. If it had been kept in France and finished, it could have been ended up being used by the Germans. And if it was towed to Britain, it could have been really useful for the British during the war. But it isn't. It started ages before, but because they have basically a slowdown on the work order because they're concentrating on battleships, it's not there. Yeah, I need to get some sort of tool which allows me to make maps as I wish, because my drawing skills are not brilliant. I know technically I have a Bachelor of Arts in history because the B-Res degree which I did hadn't been yet fully gone through, so I'm given a BA Honours instead. But I'm not an artist. There is no way, shape and form that I will ever be called an artist. Thank you very much everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.